Right, hello Year 10 and welcome to week 2 of Term 6's online lessons. Looking forward very much to seeing some of you next week in school, but for the time being we will continue with the online lessons that will be on from week 3 to week 6. They'll be uploaded as well. So today's session, I'm sorry about the quality of the PowerPoint. I managed to delete the one that I was recording. So this is a bit more like a lesson PowerPoint, but hopefully you'll still find it useful to answer the question that I gave you this week, which was on the 1905 Moroccan crisis. So within this session, we're going to run through what the causes of the Moroccan crisis were, what the events of the Moroccan crisis were, and what the consequences of it were. How did it lead to an international crisis? As always, I'll encourage you to stop this session in certain parts to go over different aspects, and maybe if you want to write things down as well. So the first thing that we're going to start with is to do it now. You've got a map there of Morocco in 1914. I'd like you to have a look at those questions and have a go at answering them. Right, so hopefully you've done that now. You've paused the video and you've answered those questions. In terms of Africa in 1914, the important things for you to know is that Germany did not control a lot of the country at all. It was very, very limited. The German presence, as you'll see here, was limited to a small part of East Africa, small part of Southwest Africa, and Cameroon and Togo. So very, very limited. The biggest powers in France, in Africa, as you will have noticed, were France and England as well. They held huge amounts of Africa. Finally, the question, how might Germany feel about their situation in Africa? Well, hopefully you've said something like the Germans would have been irritated by this or annoyed or have felt like they were losing power by not having more control over the countries of Africa. So what we're going to do in this session, these learning outcomes are slightly different to the ones that I want us to focus on. So we will focus on, as I said, what happened during the Moroccan crisis, what caused it to happen, and what the effects of it were. So words for you to think about today, and you don't need to copy these down, but you might want to pause this slide or come back to it at a later point. Kaiser is the German emperor. We're going to talk quite a lot about his role during the Moroccan crisis. The Entente Cordiale was a series of agreements on the 8th of April in 1904 between France and England. The Empire was a group of countries ruled by one country. We're going to look at how both the French and the Germans tried to expand their empires in the time of the Moroccan crisis. Splendid isolation was the British attitude. As you'll probably remember, Britain had a very, very large empire before World War One. Splendid isolation was the British idea up until about 1904 that they should just focus on their empire and they shouldn't get involved in the disputes between other countries in terms of which countries they could control. Weltpolitik is the German desire to have widespread international political power. So what caused the Moroccan crisis? The top left, you've got a map of Africa in 1914 that we looked at in the Do It Now. You will see Morocco is a small country at the top of Africa, but very strategically important because Morocco borders this area here called the Straits of Gibraltar, which meant any shipping or any large transport that wanted to come out of the Mediterranean and move around Africa would have to pass through this little area here, the Straits of Gibraltar. So if you controlled Morocco, you controlled the Straits of Gibraltar, which is why it was a really, really important place for lots of the European countries who would have had their borders on the Mediterranean, because then if they wanted to send ships, they could send them through here unstopped or unchecked by a colonial power. So why did that cause the Moroccan crisis? Well, Morocco in 1905 was an independent country. So unlike this map, Morocco wasn't actually controlled by anyone in 1905. It was controlled by a sultan who was from Morocco. No other countries could control it. So what caused the Moroccan crisis was the fact that the French, who did control at the time Africa, Chad, and other parts of Africa, Algeria as well, they wanted to control Morocco as well. And what they've been doing from about 1899 to about 1904 was secretly getting other countries, for example Spain, for example England, to agree to let them take more control of Morocco, to expand from their land in Algeria westwards towards Morocco. Part of this secret agreement was the Entente Cordiale, which was an agreement that they made with England, that England would allow them to expand westwards towards Morocco if the English were left to occupy Egypt and expand their land in Egypt. So it was an informal agreement where England said to the French they could expand towards Morocco if England would be allowed to increase their control of Egypt and expand the land that they held in Egypt. Now, why did that cause a crisis? If it had just been that issue alone, France would have quite happily, as they did in a lot of the rest of Africa, expanded their control of the region. However, we had a new person involving themselves in colonial politics, and that was this man, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the Kaiser of Germany from 1888 to 1918. And when he took over Germany, a bit like a certain ginger-haired maverick in America at the moment, he wanted to make Germany great again. He wanted to make it a major player on the world stage. And he adopted this idea from one of his politicians of Weltpolitik, giving Germany a place in the sun. And he saw in 1904 that Morocco was independent and that France had quietly been consulting with lots of other countries in Europe as to whether they could expand their presence in Morocco. And he was offended and irritated that they hadn't decided to talk to him about Morocco. He hadn't even been part of the conversation. France, when they were sitting down and deciding who they needed to talk to in order to expand their empire westwards from Algeria to Morocco, didn't even think Germany needed to be discussed with. And that caused great annoyance in Kaiser Wilhelm II and was the main and initial cause of the Moroccan crisis. So what actually happened during the Moroccan crisis? Well, France increased their presence in Morocco. As Spain and England had said, absolutely, you can expand your presence westwards towards Morocco. They did move into Morocco and started controlling different parts of the administration in Morocco and controlling things that the Sultan had formerly controlled. That meant that on the 31st of March 1905, Kaiser Wilhelm II rode into a city called Tangiers on a white horse and gave an open door speech in which he said Morocco should be left to independence and to free trade from all of the countries in Europe. He didn't want France taking over Morocco as part of their empire and then using Morocco to trade with, making themselves wealthier and stopping German interests becoming involved in Morocco. As a consequence of that speech, and with a desire to not cause conflict with Germany, a conference was called the Algeciras Conference. Algeciras is a place in Morocco. It was between lots of the different countries of Europe and the Moroccans as well. And as you can see from the dates of that conference, January to April 7th, 1906, it went on for a long time. There was a lot of discussion about who would get to control the Moroccan people. And it ended with the Kaiser, unsupported by anyone else other than Austria-Hungary, not getting any controlling stake in Morocco. In fact, the French walked away with control of a lot of the administration of Morocco and particularly the Moroccan police. So the Kaiser felt he'd sent his politicians to this conference and they'd come away with very, very little. He hadn't got any more recognition of Germany's importance or their power in the world. So he hadn't achieved the aims of his Weltpolitik policy. So your question is, why did that lead to an international crisis? Well, first of all, the Entente Cordiale, so the special agreement between France and Britain, France and England, had been made. In 1904, leading up to the crisis, France had gone to England and they'd agreed to allow each other to expand their empires within Europe. And that was a very important stepping stone to England and Britain joining together as an alliance. Previously to this, in splendid isolation, England hadn't wanted to get involved in the European squabbling. They were much happier to focus on their huge and very wealthy empire. But actually, in 1904, as a result of the Moroccan crisis, the French and the British government started working together a bit more closely. And that had two effects. One, that meant that when conflict did arrive in 1914, the English were much more likely to support the French. Two, this made Germany very nervous. If you remember from previous lessons, Germany and Europe was in a very difficult situation because they had two countries either side of them that weren't their allies. They had Russia in the east and they had France in the west. And so to see France joining with England, making itself more powerful, that made the Germans even more nervous and encouraged them to build up their army and set them on a war footing towards war with France and England. Secondly, a second reason this led to an international crisis, Kaiser Wilhelm stopped trusting his politicians. So at the conference, he'd left a politician called von Bülow to lead the negotiations and try and come away with a bit more power to trade with Morocco for Germany. And he didn't get that. So the Kaiser lost trust in politicians and the idea of using peaceful methods to solve his problems with England and France. And so next time that there was a crisis in Morocco in 1911, and you can have a look at the details of that for yourself, he was much, much, much more likely to use violence to get what he wanted. And then finally, this increased tensions between France and England and Germany. As I'd said, the Kaiser was humiliated at the conference. He didn't get what he wanted. He'd ridden into Morocco on his white horse and given this grand speech. It's sometimes referred to as saber rattling, where you show your strength. And he'd come away with nothing. So he hadn't achieved his aim of Weltpolitik. On the other side, France and England, pushed close together, were also starting to recognize Germany's desire to expand. And that would have made them nervous. France, because they had a border with Germany. So if Germany wanted to expand in mainland Europe, they might expand west into Germany or towards Belgium. Secondly, England, because England had a great empire that they wanted to protect. And if Germany was